If it proves true that there was a conspiracy to frame Karen Read for the murder of her boyfriend, Boston cop John O'Keefe, I'll quit True Crime Analysis. That's a promise. I'll do a live mea culpa show, let everyone hurl their abuse, take it like a man, then call it quits. Because if I could be this wrong about the claim I'm about to make, I should hang it up. There was no conspiracy to frame Karen Read, and that can be determined with mathematical probability beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's do it. I learned a valuable lesson in the Delphi murders, which I began studying just last year. Once friends of mine knew I was studying the case, they started sending me material. One of the first things I got was a link to a video that centered on a photo taken from the bridge through the railway slats to the woods below. He zoomed in on this photo until the forest became little more than random pixels. The narrator could apparently see things I could not, such as Abby and Libby being held down and sacrificed by a group of people. I just saw branches and pixels. But hundreds of thousands of people were taken in by this. Why? I'm talking about intelligent people. One thing it reveals is the power of suggestion. Someone plants the idea in your mind of what you're looking at, and then you start to see it, even if you're just looking at pixels. It works best, of course, if you're seeing something that some part of you really wants to see. Another thing I learned in the Delphi case is that when you learn something matters, the sequence of how you learn things really influences the narrative you perceive. And once your mind starts to see a narrative, it starts to twist everything to fit that narrative. It's very hard to resist that. One advantage I had in Delphi was actually in that I came so late to the party. This meant I could take an overview without being influenced by one narrative or another. My good friend Dave, who had many years in law enforcement and who has a very analytical mind, took a different road because he followed the case from early on. So when he learned that a creep named Keegan Klein had been catfishing Libby, he was highly suspicious of his involvement, understandably. And over the years, with each new piece of information that leaked, that suspicion grew. A few years after the murders, Klein was finally arrested on child sexual abuse material charges, unrelated to the murders, but those charges really fueled speculation, understandably, again. Then a podcast called Murder Sheet managed to obtain the transcript of the cops interrogating Klein about the murders. That really confirmed everyone's suspicions. But now those following the case since early on were actually vulnerable because each subsequent report seemed to pile on to the idea of Keegan being involved. So when a report came out that Keegan, who lived about 20 minutes from Delphi, had Googled the location of the Marathon gas station in Delphi the day of the murders, wow. The report was made again by Murder Sheet, the same people who'd found the interrogation transcript, which had been confirmed as valid. So it seemed pretty credible. And it fit the narrative, already cementing itself in people's minds. But this also shows how things get missed that normally wouldn't by astute observers, because I came in late and was going over all that material in just a matter of weeks, I didn't have a narrative already in my mind as I digested all this information. So I was open to anything reasonable. And when I read over the police interrogation, I noticed something. The cops never brought up a Google search of the gas station. They never brought it up, and they absolutely would have. Much of the interrogation centered on Klein's past Google searches, and they were trying to connect him to the murders. There was no mention of a search for the gas station, which told me it never happened. The cops had his phone. They had all his searches. In fact, he was facing decades in jail because of what they found on his phone. So if it was there, they'd have it. It was then a false report. He never searched for the gas station. This supposed search loomed large in the minds of people following the case. Why didn't no one else catch this? Because the narrative about Klein had reached that point of acceleration where everything that doesn't fit is filtered out of the mind automatically. Every seeming aha rumor is seized on with unquestioning enthusiasm. Before you say, that's not me, I'm not really so easily fooled, don't be so quick, because we're all like that. It's how the mind works. The mind is a pattern recognition machine, it's how we perceive the world. Narrative is just another pattern. In the Karen Reed case, the very first thing many of us heard about was the 227 search of how long to die in the cold, a search which would only take place if there was, in fact, a conspiracy. Once you have that 227 search in mind, it colors everything else you see. But if that search becomes uncertain, then you might start to see other aspects of the case in a different light. However, it might also be too late. Once you've started down the road on a certain narrative, even if you take away that original piece that set you on the road, everything else you've seen has already been colored by that narrative. It's very hard to undo it. There's no need to go into it at length here, but trust me, by the time the trial is done, you'll be convinced by forensic data experts that the 227 search is, at best, uncertain and more probably unlikely. I've studied data a lot this summer, and the only certain thing about any single piece of data is its uncertainty. But the 227 search has a big impact on everything else you see. Once you have 227 stamped on your brain, when you see the pictures of John's arm, and they're shown to you along with the suggestion that they are dog bites and animal scratches, that's what you see. And it's very hard to unsee it. We're going to have in the trial numerous medical personnel who examined John that day all say that the wounds were shallow abrasions and not from animal nails or bites. Numerous. But will it impact your thinking? Most people will probably continue to see in their mind's eye what they saw last April when the narrative was formed. That's what the defense is banking on. When it comes down to it, the most important attribute of a good defense has little to do with the law. It's about understanding human nature. Now, it's time for me to walk you through the reasons why there was no conspiracy. The mathematics of this is so powerful that if this analysis proves wrong and there actually is a conspiracy to frame this woman, I'll come on the air, do a mea culpa, and then retire from true crime. For the simple reason that if my analysis is actually that poor, I bring no value to the public debate. So you have my word, I'll quit. But I am, at the moment, completely confident in this analysis. A lot of people get angry at that because they have a narrative in mind. They feel very strongly about it. And what I'm going to say doesn't fit. I get it. If what I'm going to say causes that much anxiety, just turn it off. This isn't a school assignment. You don't have to watch. But if you're the kind of person that's interested in analysis, hear me out. And then, of course, make up your own mind. I'm just an old bartender who may or may not live in a yellow cottage. The conspiracy theory in this case 100% requires that someone planted taillight evidence. That's foundational. If taillight evidence was not planted, then the other weird stuff that might pop up, things that seem odd at the moment, don't matter at all. Numerous taillight pieces and one large chunk, all matching to Karen's SUV, were found at the scene. Unless someone planted those pieces, there's no conspiracy. If those pieces were not planted, it doesn't matter why the Alberts didn't wake up. If those pieces weren't planted, it doesn't matter who deleted the Ring video at John's house. If those pieces weren't planted, it doesn't matter whether Michael Proctor's second cousin once dated Brian Albert's niece. You have to start with foundational evidence, and you have to calculate. That's where the math comes in. Means and motive. Planting evidence in a murder case in order to frame an innocent woman. I think we can all agree that's a crime. Anyone doing that would be well aware it's a crime. As with any crime, you start with means and motive. Were there the means for taillight pieces to be planted in the mounds of snow? Can we assign some kind of probability to that? Karen got home at 12:41 and put her SUV in the garage. As far as we now know, she didn't leave again until just after 5 a.m. when she went to search for John, then drove to Jen McCabe's. There's no indication anyone ever broke into John's garage. In the house was Karen and John's 14-year-old niece. In the Ring video of Karen leaving at 5, there are no footprints visible in the snow, so it seems safe to say it's extremely unlikely anyone broke into the garage at this time. Karen returned sometime before 6 a.m. with Kerry Roberts and Jen McCabe. They put Karen's SUV back in the garage and went out looking for John. John was quickly found, and by 6:20 was on the way to the hospital. His family was called, and they started arriving at John's house soon after that, where the niece was. So John's niece was home alone with the SUV, say from 30 to 45 minutes maybe. Did someone break in at that time and pry taillight pieces? Again, it seems very highly unlikely. There's no sign anyone ever broke into the garage. No one claims that happened. The niece didn't hear anything like that. And there were presumably no footprints in the snow. From 7 until later in the morning, the home was filled with members of John's family. Then Karen's dad brought Karen home from the hospital. A short time later, he drove her to their home in Dighton. So I think it's safe to say that up to this point in time, the taillight could not have been tampered with. They then left the SUV in the driveway in Dighton. It was under ring surveillance. Snow continued hard all day. Anyone approaching that vehicle would have left tracks in the snow that'd be noticed. So while it's not impossible that Tom Cruise ran some kind of Mission Impossible operation to pry pieces of taillight while the SUV was sitting there in the driveway, it's very, very unlikely. The vehicle was towed to Canton at 4:12 p.m. That's about a 45-minute drive in normal conditions. Even the conspiracy theorists point to this period and a brief window while the SUV was in Canton as the only time tampering could have been done. The state police CERT team reports finding the pieces at 5:45 p.m. As the theory goes, the SUV arrived in Canton around 5, and the trooper leading the investigation, Michael Proctor, supposedly pried pieces of taillight, raced to the crime scene, and placed them in the snow before the CERT team began. What are the odds of such a thing happening? Well, what's the earliest the trooper could have arrived back at the crime scene with his bag of taillight pieces? Let's say 5:15. The way the conspiracy theorists seem to imagine it, the trooper arrived at an unguarded crime scene, trudged through the snow, dropping the pieces, then left or maybe waited in the car. So I guess the idea is that the CERT team arrived at an empty scene around 5:30, swooped in, and found the pieces just sitting on the top of the snow 15 minutes later. None of that should pass your smell test. We won't know until police testify at the trial, but we're likely going to learn that squad cars were sitting there guarding the scene all day. They certainly didn't swoop in like a SWAT team and storm the crime scene. Here's news footage showing the CERT team beginning its investigation. Note, they're all walking out with shovels under spotlights that have been set up. And news footage implies news trucks. How long were they there? Takes time to set those things up. So for me, the idea that Trooper Proctor arrived at an empty scene around 5:15 or even 5 borders on absurd. The conspiracy theorists have the idea that Proctor walked out like Andy Dufresne in the Shawshank Redemption, casually dropping pieces in the snow. But look at the main piece. Those are shovel marks around it. Again, here's the news footage. Note the shovels in the hands of the state troopers. The accident scene had been plowed and the pieces of taillight were buried inside mounds of snow. If you've been told otherwise, it might be time to start questioning those sources. The DA claims Trooper Proctor was nowhere near the crime scene during this small window of time where evidence could have been planted. Maybe the DA is lying, or maybe the trooper had some other trooper do it for him. But these are all elements that keep cranking up the improbability of the conspiracy theory. The more unlikely things that are required to happen, the more improbable a theory becomes. And the odds multiply. Say the New England Patriots have a 1 in 100 chance of winning the title this year, and the Red Sox have the same. What are the odds both win the title in this same year? Well, 100 times 100, or 1 in 10,000. And a whole lot of unlikely things have to happen for taillight pieces to have been planted. Trooper has to pry off pieces without anyone seeing him. He has to race to the scene and bury it in the tough plowed snow. We'll eventually find out who was present at the scene at 5 o'clock during the trial. Were the news crews there? Was the CERT team setting up their spotlights? How many troopers were guarding the crime scene? If Proctor managed to walk out through a preserved crime scene, did no one on the search team notice the fresh tracks in the snow? And the trooper then either has to get the DA to lie about him not being there, or he has to expand the conspiracy by getting other troopers to help him. All of these things are just very unlikely. Also consider this. John was found at the crime scene 11 hours before. Karen got home at 12:41. That's 16 hours earlier. If at any time during those 16 hours, if anyone took a photo of the intact taillight or any clear video emerged, the whole conspiracy would be blown wide open, which would result in the trooper going to jail for a very long time. You can't weigh the likelihood of the trooper planting evidence without considering this. 16 hours after the event is an incredibly long time. Karen could have snapped a photo, her dad, the Dighton cop who examined it. All it would take is for one person to have snapped a photo. If a cop is going to pry pieces of taillight in order to plant them at a murder scene, he'll know he better do it soon after the accident. To attempt this 16 hours later, he would know is reckless and likely to be exposed. Which brings us to motive. Whenever I bring up the fact that there's no known motive anywhere sufficient to explain the super risky planting of evidence, people come at me with, "But Kev, you don't understand how corrupt cops are," or "It happens all the time." It's not just a matter of the integrity of cops, their willingness to be corrupt. It's about how any human being, even the most corrupt, calculates his own self-interest. Planting evidence in a murder case 16 hours after the murder is incredibly high risk. You get caught, you're going to jail for a very long time. To this, they say, "But Kev, you don't understand. They never think they'll get caught." This isn't fixing parking tickets. This isn't just passively helping a conspiracy by looking the other way. You're talking about prying pieces from an SUV 16 hours later and then burying them at the scene in front of other cops, possibly news trucks. So don't give me that they never think they'll get caught. It's asinine. Of course they're aware of the high risk of being part of a murder conspiracy. To be willing to take part in that, a cop would need an incredibly compelling motive. Something like, "We have your mom tied to a chair in the cellar, so you better play ball." I'm sorry if I'm losing patience, but if you find yourself making arguments like Proctor did it to be cool with the cool people, it might be time to seek help. So let's be generous here, very generous, and say there's a possibility of a compelling motive we've never learned. Maybe Proctor's mom really was being held prisoner. I would suggest the odds of the existence of a motive that compelling is like 1 in 10,000. But again, we'll be very generous and say it was 1 in 10. How's that? Is that okay? You know, crazy, but we're erring on the side of caution. So let's do the math. There's a 1 in 10 chance Proctor could bury taillight pieces and not be seen. 1 in 10 chance the DA is lying about Proctor not being there. And a 1 in 10 chance there's some wild motive we've not learned about. Even with that super generous math, it means there's only a 1 in 1,000 chance Proctor planted taillight pieces. But of course, we still have more math to do. Sorry, don't worry, there won't be a test at the end. But before we move on, one more thing on the taillight. When I spoke with journalist Aidan Kearney, he told me the main reason he believed there was a conspiracy was that the Canton police themselves did not find taillight pieces that morning. Well, I'm sorry, that just doesn't hold up. In Massachusetts, the investigation of any violent or suspicious death automatically transfers to the custody of the state police, except in the big cities of Boston, Worcester, and Springfield. John was clinging to life when he was taken from the scene, but there probably wasn't much hope of him surviving. In any case, he was pronounced dead at 7:50. At that time, the case officially became the custody of the state police. The CERT team is highly trained for such investigations. Local Canton cops are not. And the very last thing they'd ever do is take a shovel to a state police crime scene. So they had no chance of ever finding those buried pieces of taillight. No chance. This part of the conspiracy theory can be, frankly, just dismissed. We also must discuss a claim that's emerged by my friend Sean McDonough. Sean first reported this to me back in June. An officer named Brian Wanless, who has since retired, is said to have been secretly ordered to remove the taillight from Karen's SUV. I can't show it here, but Sean sent me a photo of the SUV with the taillight removed. Recently, Sean posted more extensively on this, and it's a very professionally written analysis by a man who spent his life in law enforcement at the Drug Enforcement Agency. Let me read some of what Sean posted since it's much better in his words than mine. So, quote, "I had received information from a very credible and reliable law enforcement officer about a conversation the source had with Wanless. The law enforcement source told me that Wanless, during a face-to-face meeting, told the law enforcement source of being summoned to the Canton police station in order to assist with the processing of Karen Reed's SUV. At the time, Wanless was in the unique position of being a full-time police officer and the owner of a local auto body shop known as Brilliance Auto in Canton. According to the law enforcement source, Wanless said he was asked to remove the taillight from the SUV. According to this same law enforcement source, Wanless has told other former Canton officers that the taillight was intact with a piece of red plastic located inside the taillight housing. When the law enforcement source asked Wanless who summoned him to the Canton police station, Wanless refused to answer. Additionally, when the law enforcement source asked Wanless about any reports written, Wanless responded, "I don't know what they did." Sean's post is longer and makes some very valid points about the chain of custody of this key evidence and the documentation of that chain of custody. I'm not a cop, but that kind of thing strikes me as very important in any honest investigation. Let's first start with Sean's source. He says from a very credible and reliable law enforcement officer about a conversation the source had with Wanless. And then at other points, he seems to be talking about his source talking to sources who talk to Wanless. So you're getting down the food chain here on these sources. The closest we could be is that Sean talked to someone who talked to Brian Wanless himself. If Sean had talked himself to Officer Wanless, it would mean much more to me, but this feels pretty secondhand and even thirdhand in this information. And to be frank, we've been burned before by that very source or a similar one, with reports that John O'Keefe called the Canton police to report Colin was dealing drugs in the neighborhood. That was this summer. We got that from those same sources, and that proved false. So I suggest extreme caution with some of these sources. But we can actually dismiss this whole part of the conspiracy theory based on one thing, the timeline. The theory seems to be this. The SUV was towed to Canton. Let's say the tow truck made great time in the snow and arrived around 5 p.m. Now, Officer Wanless must have been instructed not only to remove the taillight, but to do it like he was working a pit stop at a racetrack, because time was of the essence. The state police CERT team was setting up on the crime scene, or soon would be. News trucks were probably already set up, or soon would be. Remember, the state police found the main piece of taillight at 5:45. So let's say it's a 10-minute drive to Fairview, the crime scene, from the police station. So is this how they see the operation? The tow truck screeches into the station around 5. They hurry the SUV off the truck. The tow truck is shooed out. There's no time for chit-chat with the driver. Officer Wanless races into action, pulling the taillight off the truck. Proctor, I guess, makes sure no one else enters the garage. It's a rush job. In fact, Sean has shown me a photo of the SUV with a deep gouge. He says it's from a screwdriver used to pull the taillight off. Wanless owns an auto body shop, so he must have been under extreme pressure to make such a mistake. What is the earliest time that Proctor would have the taillight pieces in hand? The tow truck whips into the garage at 5 or a little after, unloads the SUV, and everyone is chased out so Wanless can pry off the entire taillight like he's changing a tire at the Indy 500. I guess if everything went right, Proctor could leave the garage at what, 5:15? I mean, if these guys are crazy efficient, I guess maybe you want to give him 5:10. Then it still takes him 10 minutes to get to the crime scene. He has to bury those pieces in the snow, in tough plowed snow. I don't see him being able to do that without a shovel. So Proctor wanders out onto the snowy crime scene under the glare of the CERT team spotlight and the news trucks. He's carrying a shovel. And at 5:45, just minutes later, the team finds the main piece of taillight, right where Proctor just buried it. Look, I love Sean, but there ain't enough tequila in Mexico to make me buy that. The only way such a theory can work is if the whole state police CERT team is in on this. It's the only way. Everyone on that team, every single state cop present that afternoon. Because one nosy cop could blow it for them all. One honest cop who isn't comfortable planting evidence in a murder case. That's where we're left on this. You have to accept that all the state cops would be in on this in order to, what? Protect the nephew of a Boston cop? Do you really want to hang your hat on that theory? Okay, so I very conservatively calculated that the odds of Proctor planting taillight pieces as 1 in 1,000. Very conservative. What are the odds that every state cop involved in the investigation is in on the conspiracy to plant evidence and frame an innocent woman for murder? All of them, risking their careers and their freedom. Those odds surely must be way more than 1 in 1,000. So I guess maybe the conspiracy theorists are better off sticking just to the Proctor theory that he did this by himself. But like I said, conservatively speaking, I would calculate those odds at 1 in 1,000. But let's continue on with figuring out the likelihood of a conspiracy. John O'Keefe was examined by multiple medical staff that morning before they spoke to the state troopers. They all agreed that John had not been in a fight. They all described the wounds on John's right arm as shallow abrasions. The medical examiner did her work 2 days later, and she concurred, adding that the wounds on the arm were caused by a blunt object, not teeth, not animal nails, not shards of cocktail glass for that matter. Until the trial, all we can go on is the trooper's reports and what's outlined in the charging documents. But unless something shocking happens, we're going to hear multiple medical personnel tell us that these were not caused by an animal. Of course, that doesn't completely eliminate the possibility. Everyone is vulnerable to buying into a narrative, including medical personnel. So maybe the story of Karen hitting John with her SUV was already sweeping through and influencing them. Or maybe all these people are actually also part of the conspiracy. And the issue is one of probability. The odds multiple medical personnel are wrong or are in on the conspiracy. Remember the odds I assigned to planting the taillight pieces? I very conservatively put it at 1 in 1,000. But now you have to factor in the odds of multiple medical personnel being wrong or lying in part of the conspiracy. Let's be generous and put the odds of that at 1 in 10. Okay, so 1 in 10 for the medical personnel being wrong or lying, times the 1 in 1,000 for the possibility of Proctor planting the taillight pieces. And now we're at overall odds of 1 in 10,000 for there being a conspiracy. But there's plenty more. As I said earlier, if there's anything I've learned about data, it's that any single data point comes with a significant amount of uncertainty. However, the more data points you string together, the less the uncertainty. GPS data comes from a one-way signal from a satellite which a sensor in your phone picks up. It doesn't work well inside a building, but outdoors it comes with a much lower degree of error than cell tower pings. Generally, the error rate for GPS is 15 feet. If you have a lot of data points within a narrow time period, you can reduce the likelihood of the device being outside the margin of error. You can't completely eliminate the possibility, but you can really reduce it. Other factors can help. In Moscow, Idaho, Brian Kohlberger's phone was tracked 11 times in the 6 months before the murders to be near the victim's house. A reasonable question would be whether he was going to a nearby house and not targeting the eventual victims. Maybe he was hanging out in the sorority house. Because of the margin of error, it's a reasonable question. But on one occasion, Brian was so close to the house that his phone automatically connected to the Wi-Fi of the victim's house. Therefore, the evidence he was stalking people in that house is much stronger. So what you want to do is look at the totality of data. So what about the health app data on John's phone? Well, that app is actually using GPS signals and running it through its own algorithms, so it's more processed. But also, it's not designed for accuracy. It's designed to be helpful for you while exercising. Hopefully helpful enough that you'll enable the app and allow the app developer to obtain your valuable information. The GPS data from John's phone is not going to be certain, but it is going to be the information with the smallest margin of error. And it's pretty clear from that John didn't go inside the house. In fact, it shows that at the time John's health app thought he was going up and down stairs, or at least Rich Green, the forensic data analyst hired by the defense, thought he was going up and down stairs. According to the actual GPS data, they were still more than half a mile away. And you can accuse me of trusting one data over another. The GPS data is much more accurate than the health app, which is trying to help you jog. Eventually, Karen will be forced to release her phone data, and if it matches John's, and it should, no one will question the GPS data released about John's phone. And then no one will talk about the health app data anymore, except for people trying desperately to cling to a conspiracy theory. GPS data is by far the most accurate. What degree of confidence can we have that the data shows John never entered the house? Well, I'm not qualified to give you an answer on that, but I think we can be reasonably confident. So let's do the math. Say the data shows there's a 1 in 10 chance John actually went inside the house based on the margin of error. Factor that with the 1 in 10 chance all the medical personnel made a mistake on the wounds on John's arm, and a 1 in 1,000 chance Proctor planted taillight evidence. So that's 10 by 10 times 1,000. So now we're at a 1 in 100,000 chance that there's actually a conspiracy. That's still not enough odds for you? Okay, we can add more multipliers. What are the odds all the people needed to stay quiet in this conspiracy would stay quiet? The people in the house, the medical staff, various troopers and local police, the DA, the tow truck driver. It's hard to say just how many people are needed to pull this conspiracy off, but it's quite a few. For example, Proctor's partner, Trooper Buchanan. Hard to pull off a conspiracy without him knowing something, if not outright participating. Or the troopers on the CERT team. And all it takes is one person to crack and the conspiracy is blown. So let's be super conservative and say there's a 1 in 10 chance no one cracks and goes to the police. Well, now your odds of pulling off this conspiracy are 1 in a million. Well, so you add that multiplier to the 1 in 100,000 chance that we're up to, and now you're up to 1 in a million. There's more we could factor in. Who erased the Ring video of Karen getting home at 12:41? Isn't the odds-on favorite Karen? Why has Karen changed her story multiple times? Did Trooper Proctor really plant microscopic taillight pieces on John's clothing? Or what about the electronic vehicle data, which says the SUV backed into John at high speed and kept going? But the important thing is to focus on the foundational evidence. When you drill down to the bedrock, the cornerstone to this case, as I've said, is the planting of taillight pieces. If that didn't happen, then there's literally no case for a conspiracy. Zero. And mathematically, the odds against planting taillight pieces already put this case way beyond a reasonable doubt. And people say, but what about? Stop. There are weird things that pop up in every case. Human beings are unpredictable. And sometimes they try to hide things that have nothing to do with the actual case, but might embarrass them in some other way. Most of the things that seem odd right now will eventually be explained in trial. Some probably won't, though, because there are always things like that in any sweeping investigation. However, if no taillight pieces were planted, all that other stuff is just, well, stuff. What about the 227 search of how long to die in the cold? Well, the planted taillight evidence and the 227 Google search have a proportional relationship. To the degree that one is not true, the other can't be either. So if there's only a 1 in 100,000 chance the taillight evidence was planted, then there's only a 1 in a 100,000 chance the 227 search ever took place. You can quibble with the math. I myself would put it more close to 1 in a million. Maybe you think there's a 1 in 500,000 chance that pieces were planted, or maybe you're going to be a diehard and hold out for the 1 in 100,000. Now, I'm not the luckiest gambler in the world, but I'll take those odds. So I'll gladly wager my little yellow cottage that the 227 search simply never happened, which means I would not expect me to be closing shop anytime in the foreseeable future. Sorry.